Hey, I gotta mention tomorrow's my big weigh-in, dietary weigh-in. Been, of course, since late September. I have been a candidate with the Total Body Transformation System, which is a healthy way to lose weight, and a lot of people are promoting these fad diets. I got a story for you. I tried one of those diets, which was low carb a few years ago, where somebody said you can eat all the steak and eggs you want. I like eggs and I like steak, but not that much, and eating them every day. And I know this might be TMI. I waited until after 9 o'clock because it's not the breakfast hour now for most people. I was on this diet, and after about a week, it seemed to be going well. And then all of a sudden, I couldn't go to the bathroom. I'll put it that way. And so I had to stop the diet. I talked to a friend of mine who was a nurse, and she said, "No, I think you should stop." I pretty much already didn't need the advice. I'd made up my mind. But I'm telling you, there are safe and healthy ways to lose weight. The Total Body Transformation System is one of those. And it was developed by a company that's been in business now more than 2 decades. It has an A-plus rating from the Better Business Bureau, the youngest company ever featured on the cover of Success magazine. Meanwhile, this diet, the Total Body Transformation System, is supported by a brilliant team of scientists from some of the most prestigious universities in the country, Cornell, Columbia, and Tufts being among them. And we wanted to point out as well that you can burn 6 times more fat and lose 8 times more weight than normal results from diet and exercise alone. And the meal replacement plan is healthier than most of the meals you eat. And when people ask me about cost, I tell them the meal replacement is about the same as what you would be spending on groceries. So, pretty much no difference there. Also, you can have a healthy amount of calories. I've often joked, I did some research into what I could eat, and I know a lot of places in town I can go get a really good meal and still be under my calorie limit for the entire day. And I wanted to point out it's backed up with a full money back guarantee. The average participant will lose 22 pounds and 4 inches off his or her waist in just 60 days. If you would like to know more, you can contact marketing executive Don Chandler. He's at 208-731-3560 in the Twin Falls area. Again, that's Don Chandler, and he's at 208-731-3560. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310, KLIX, and newsradio1310.com. Telephone number, if you'd like to reach our program today, is 736-0300. That's 736-0300. I saw a story today, and I'm going to try to relate this, if I could, just briefly, to some of the issues going on with weather and the like, especially some of the nastier weather that we're seeing in places such as here in Idaho with some of the flooding last week, and what they could be up for in places like California. I saw this today. This comes from a website called What's Up With That? Lessons learned from the end of California's, and then he puts this in quotation marks, permanent drought. Remember all those predictions of a permanent drought in California? This is from the writer Larry Coomer. He says those were examples of why 3 decades of climate alarmism has not convinced the American people to take severe measures to fight this so-called man-made, they call it anthropogenic, that's a big word, meaning man-made, climate change. Alarmists exaggerate the science and are proven wrong repeatedly. When will the left learn that doomster lies do not work? And then he provided a bunch of headlines that we've seen over recent years about how this was going to be a permanent drought. California was going to dry up and blow away. It's a little bit like the stories I heard when I was a little boy 40, 50 years ago, that California was going to fall into the ocean. And we're still waiting for that to happen. And he says, now, of course, we're seeing the media take a different approach with all of the storms that are coming in. But he said, media itself has harmed its reputation in the coverage of this story by being, well, henny penny, running around the barnyard essentially saying the sky is falling. And he goes on to say this, clickbait, which is what we have in modern media. Modern media now, most of it has migrated over to the web, is no longer just in print. Modern media has migrated over to the web. And the writer goes on to say, this has been their way since they discovered that weather pornography was good clickbait and might support their campaign for aggressive public policy measures to fight man-made climate change. The result? contributing to the public's loss of trust in news media and an almost complete failure to get their policy changes. And this, as in other things, only a reality-based community can reform America. Too bad neither left nor right has any interest in giving up their tribal beliefs to focus on the often inconvenient truth. I was looking through that, and of course, we talked with Randy Staples in the last half hour about the evacuations. The last figure I saw, because of the potential dam collapse in California, 188,000 people evacuated from their homes. Now, folks, that's almost as big as the city of Boise, which is about, I think, 215,000 people. It's almost as big as Spokane, which is right around the 200,000 mark. We have a caller with us. Caller, we've got about a minute before the break. You're up next. You're on the air. All right. Well, you can try back after the break if you'd like to do that. Bill Colley with you, of course, this morning. Also, I mentioned this earlier. This guy is becoming one of my favorite legislators. Ion Boise from Betsy Russell at the Spokesman Review. Freshman Senator Dan Foreman, a Republican from Moscow, says he believes climate change is a liberal scam. Now, this guy beat one of the most powerful Democrats in Idaho last year in the general election, John Rushy. Rushy, though, was a fairly conservative Democrat. From what I've read, he was a pro-life Democrat, which is kind of strange in this day and age. But he said it is a liberal scam. This is Dan Foreman, said it's a liberal scam and ridiculous nonsense. The Lewiston Tribune reports that Foreman, who sent an email late last week forcibly stating his views on the topic in response to an email from an Idaho mom concerned about legislative changes to school science standards, says there's, quote, no substance, unquote, to concerns about global warming or human impact on the environment changing the Earth's climate, even though the University of Idaho in his district is involved in major research on climate change. Yeah, and they're making how much money on this major research at the same university? Oh, that's right. Ka-ching, ka-ching. A woman who was on that UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change said last week at a news conference in London that it was all a hoax to destroy capitalism. You're not seeing that in the New York Times, though, or the Washington Post, or even the Spokesman Review, are you? 9:30, Bill Colley with you on Top Story. Your telephone call's on the way. It's 25 right now on News Radio 1310, KLIX, and newsradio1310.com. So you have people who work for the United Nations, and you have people who work for NOAA. They are saying that people were cooking the data to try to make it look as if we had to take all of these drastic measures with climate change. And they were telling us, look, I'll give you an example where I first really, I'd never been completely convinced one way or the other. But going back, I think it was 2012, I was still living in the Chesapeake Bay region. And I remember one Saturday having to drive to the grocery store. Now, when it's 105 degrees here, people always say back on the East Coast, yeah, but it's a dry heat. 105 is hot, no matter where you are. But if you're in the Chesapeake Bay region in the middle of summer, it's sticky. So it was 105 degrees. I jumped into the Jeep and I was driving to the grocery store and I looked at the gauge, the temperature gauge on the dashboard, and it read 105. And this is in a tourist town. There was not a soul on the streets that day because of the hot, sticky weather, and it stayed that way in the upper 90s and in the low 100s for about a week. And media just suddenly, because it impacted the Washington media especially, media there started saying, well, now here's your evidence of the end of the world, and this is all because you conservatives out there refuse to buy into man-made global warming. It's all your fault, and you've helped destroy the world, and if we don't take action now, and it's probably too late, but if we don't go starve half the world off to put in our nefarious plans and destroy capitalism while we're at it so we can have a worldwide socialist government, this is all you're doing, and here's evidence of it. But what they failed to mention, right up until we got that hot stretch in early July, in June, I was walking around in a jacket. It had been cloudy and cold through the whole month of June. And then after a week of these really broiling hot temperatures, the weather broke. And the rest of summer, below 80s for highs, high 70s to low 80s, and that was it. So the so-called end of the world lasted a week. And with that, I started saying, somehow these people will exaggerate any weather event. And a friend of mine actually worked doing media, the type of guy who doesn't talk much at work, but he works for a college of environmental science and forestry. And his job is to put reporters in touch with all of the liberals who are claiming the world is coming to an end at his college. But he was telling me when no one else was listening one day, he said something along these lines. He said, they have built an unassailable orthodoxy. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, if it's too hot, they tell you it's climate change. If it's too cold, they tell you it's climate change. Therefore, they figure no one can argue with them. In other words, you can't attack them by saying, well, why are we, when it was 14 below zero one morning last month when I left for work, they'll say, well, that's because of your man-made activity. But if it's 105, they'll say that's because of your man-made activity. So they're just trying to, cordon off their argument from any criticism. Yet for years they beat this climate alarm over the drought in California, and California may be washing away in the next month. And we're not going to be doing a whole lot better about it here in parts of Idaho if we have a meltdown quickly in the mountains. And as I was saying earlier, if you go to our website, I posted some of the photographs I took on Saturday. Saturday, it was beautiful Saturday with just blazing sunshine, no clouds. Yesterday was sort of an odd duck of days, wasn't it? I got up in the morning and I went to church and it was sunny. And then when I got home and I had to do some writing and then I went out for a walk, it was cloudy and then it got sunny again. So yesterday was a little bit different. But I grabbed the zoom lens and I went outside and I walked over to the canyon on Saturday and I took some photographs of the mountains in the distance. And I posted this to our website. Now, you're aware I'm not an Idaho native, so I can't speak as to what happened here, much less 5 years ago versus 50 years ago. But I do talk to a lot of friends who grew up here, and they're telling me there's a lot of snow on those mountains. And if that all melts at once, and you think about just how bad the weather was, Benito Baeza was saying to me this morning, he said, the problems we had with the flooding last week, that was all just from the melt here in the valley. What happens when it all takes place, if it all takes place at once up in the mountains? I actually believe that some of this snow, a lot of this snow may stay there all summer long and we'll just have a bigger pile next year because of it. But it definitely shows you that all of the henny pennies out there who are screaming the sky is falling right now should be eating crow. They're not, though, because being liberals, they think they're the smartest people who walk into any room and they don't owe you any apology. And yet you've got people who are lying or were lying and are admitting it now, as I said, from the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change as well as NOAA, and mainstream media is trying to sweep that under the rug. Bill Colley with you on Top Story. We've got about 20 minutes left to go today. You're listening to News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. And if you're struggling to hear our program today, I'd like to recommend you've got to get in touch with our friends at Mount Harrison Audiology in Rupert. There are many choices available for better hearing health. Why would you choose Mount Harrison Audiology? Well, compassion. Dr. Christine Pickup and her staff pride themselves on caring for each individual with customized and personal treatment plans. Mount Harrison Audiology cares about your health goals and is going to work with you to provide the best care possible. Call Mount Harrison Audiology for your next appointment, 208-312-0957. That's 312-0957. And we're headed for the stretch run of this program. It's 9:43. And going to warm up into the low 40s today. We're at 25. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. I don't know that if California ends up with a lot of really bad flooding, if California is suddenly going to go through with its plans for seceding from the union, because, see, if you have a lot of bad flooding, it means the federal government comes in and pays for all of the repairs and you get all that disaster assistance. But if you're on your own, you may not get that. I bring this up because, first of all, it's not going to happen. All of the discussion about seceding is just a lot of hot air because California didn't get its way when it came to the general election. However, since we're on the subject, if California did secede, what would it do to the rest of the country? I came across a video yesterday from an Now, Englishmen lately are, there was a fat Englishman at some award show last night who was telling us how we need to run our country. They can't run their own. I mean, they destroyed their empire over the last 60, 70, 80 years. but they want to give us advice on how I guess we can go about destroying our own country. This is a fellow by the name of Simon Whistler. I know it's his name. Well, he's British. It makes sense. Simon Whistler. I called this. It's shorter. It's about a minute and 20 seconds from a 10-minute video. But he was rattling off 10 things the rest of America would lose if his fellow liberals in California end up packing in and going their own way. But I want you to listen to a couple of these, and then I have some reflection on that.
California is responsible for about 16.5% of all of America's fruit, vegetable, and nut productions. They are the leading producer of 81 crops. This includes producing 99% of all the artichokes, grapes and raisins, kiwi fruit, olives, peaches, and plums. They also produce 99% of walnuts, almonds, and pistachios. California is also the leading producer of such everyday staples as garlic, onion, carrots, avocados, and spinach. If California were to leave the Union, these fruits and vegetables would at least go up in cost, simply because shipping it would be more difficult. Instead of just crossing state lines, it will now all become international shipments. That could raise the prices of a lot of everyday food, and that's without the tariffs. If you tack those on, then expect the price of fruits, vegetables, and nuts to skyrocket.
Number 9. Wine will cost more.
While there are wine vineyards found in every state, the majority of wine in the United States is produced in California. In fact, out of all the wine produced, 88.5% of it comes from California. Many of the grapes used for wine are grown in the world-famous Napa Valley. Of course, if California did leave the Union, the rest of the states would be able to get Californian wine. However, there could be heavy tariffs on it. Since wine is produced in every state, the tariffs could be massive to encourage people to buy American wine and help the industry grow.
Number 8. Loss of major companies.
So he mentioned the loss of fruits and nuts the rest of us would have. And California is obviously filled with fruits and nuts. He also mentioned wine, and, that we might not be able to, well, first of all, I don't know that everyone's sitting out there thinking, gosh, how am I going to get sloppy drunk if California secedes? Now, I didn't play the whole thing because, as I said, it's 10 minutes long. One of the other things he said we would lose is dairy. Well, hold on a minute here. We had a caller last week who brought up a good point. If California wanted to secede, the liberals apparently think they're taking the whole state. Well, if you're out in the Imperial and San Joaquin Valley or even Northern California, you have a lot of Republicans. Those are all those farming areas. Those areas are also dependent on water, which comes from places like the Colorado River. And if California is an independent country, those farms may not get any of that water. So the only secession is going to be Los Angeles County, San Diego, San Francisco, Oakland, Stockton, Modesto, and Sacramento, right? Maybe Fresno. That's it. They're going to be little islands in a Republican sea, which is what these people who think they're going to just take the whole state away don't seem to be grasping. Now, he mentions as well corporate headquarters. How many corporate headquarters do you think would stay in Silicon Valley if suddenly they didn't have access to capital markets in New York City? They'd pack up and move too. I don't know. Maybe they'd come to Twin Falls. 9:48, we have a caller with us. Caller, you're up next. You're on KLIX.
Well, that's why they call California the granola state, fruit, nuts, and flakes. Because, well, that's what runs the state. I lived there for a couple of years, and believe me, if you really go down to the grocery store, find out where your fresh produce comes from, it's California. It was really an eye-opener. And but the reason I wanted to call is make comment about the climate thing.
Sure.
I'm old enough to see how cold it can get. I went to a university where it was 50 below zero in the early 60s, absolute temperature. And yet we go through these cycles. In some cases, like in Texas, I have a sister who lives in Amarillo. It was 88 2 days ago. I just checked. It's 33 and snowing right now. So, so climate change can come abruptly, but the Rockefeller Foundation, George Soros, through the United Nations, been pushing this Agenda 21, basically to destroy our economy so that we can become a third world country, so we can merge into this utopian new world order under the United Nations. So, there's a movement to get us out, Bill. HR 193 is the new bill, but they've been our enemy from day one, and the Rockefellers, They use these tax-free foundations, just like the Clintons did, to basically uh, put forth their socialist New World Order agenda. And we just have to wake up to that they want to destroy us as a country. And they're using the climate change, global warming thing it's a total hoax. It's a scam from top to bottom, has been from day one. And anybody really investigates it. But the only people that get any news media coverage, of course, is the handful of James Hansen's from NASA and so forth, and of course Al Gore. And now we got these old fogies, Jim Baker and George Shultz, these dinosaurs from the Republican Party coming in wanting carbon tax. It's just totally ludicrous what they're trying to do, but I think a lot of people are getting smart, and I appreciate your research on it.
Here's something I wanted to mention to you too as well. When I was hosting a show, first few years I was hosting talk radio programs, I had a guy call me up and tell me that I was wrong because he said I was talking about weather, and climate and weather were different things. I understand that, but an inch is a different thing than a foot or a yard. However, feet and yards are made up of a series of inches. So weather, if you look at weather as being akin to an inch, and then you look at climate as being akin to a ruler that's a foot or a yard long, then all of a sudden you realize climate is actually just a series of weather events, as a yard is a series of inches. And when they make these arguments, they ignore the fact that the weather and the climate are changing all the time.
Well, absolutely. And even the Weather Channel, that's been a big promoter of the global warming hoaxes, they had a special with weather and volcanoes. So when Mount Pinatubo went off, and I didn't catch the year, and I think in
92, I believe. Yeah.
Yeah, the global temperature went down 1.3 degrees. And so one volcano wiped out all of the human activity in one day and put more pollutants in the air than all of human activity for a whole year. I mean, they even admitted that. And it was really interesting that they would actually broadcast that. I guess it slipped through somehow. So anyway, folks, we just have to deal with it. The weather goes in cycles, mainly controlled by the sun, sunspots and sun activity. Been going on. There's 11-year cycles, 22 and longer cycles. Been going on forever. Just to be thankful we aren't in the ice age where there'd be 4 times the height of the Empire State Building covering most of half of North America. I mean, everybody says, oh, the glaciers are melting. Thank God, because, I mean, let's face it, we really wouldn't want to go back to 20,000 years ago, which geologically is just a snap of the fingers, and see that kind of weather come back. So anyway.
Thank you much for the call. Speaking of that whole glacial runoff, the Bonneville flood, which carved this canyon and a lot of the topography in this area, that was climate change. I mean, that was severe climate change. We're not dealing with anything remotely like that. 9:53, Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310, KLIX and newsradio1310.com. We're at 24. Caller Adrian referenced climate change, and cap and trade is back. He mentioned that, and he mentioned former Reaganites who are involved. Well, this comes from the Washington Times today. Stephen Moore is the writer. Carbon tax will not help environment, and it will make Americans poorer. So let's get this straight, he writes. We're going to tax the producers of the economy and then give the money to people who don't produce, and this isn't going to negatively affect the economy? If this makes sense, then why not adopt a 100% tax of production and then redistribute the money to everyone? Then he writes, my colleague Katie Tubb at the Heritage Foundation has noted another glaring flaw with the carbon tax. While it is true that a carbon tax is a much more efficient way to cap carbon dioxide emissions than the mishmash of current EPA regulations, renewable energy standards, and subsidies for wind and solar power, the high likelihood is that the carbon tax will not be a replacement for these economically destructive policies, rather an addition to the regulations and subsidies. It is naive in the extreme to think otherwise. We had one of my former talk show past cities, a congressman who was a Republican, who was big on this whole carbon tax, which Sean Hannity famously nicknamed cap and tax. instead of cap and trade. But he was big on claiming we needed to do this to save the environment. And as a Rhino Republican, he got a sphincter whooped in a primary one year and was gone for good. But I'll never forget a woman who was her father-in-law had been the Republican National Committee chair in the early 1970s, and I worked with her for about a year at a radio station, and so she was very supportive of this very same congressman. But one day, she had one of those admissions that you see once in a while that people, as our caller said, they let slip. And what she did is she said to me, well, his law firm is going to make a killing with all of these carbon tax credits. And I said, what do you mean? She said, well, they're going to be doing all the paperwork and the trading of them. So you're telling me he is suddenly an environmentalist because his law partners are going to get filthy rich off this? Yep. That's why you have Republicans who claim that this is a good idea, and they join their fellow travelers on the liberal side in promoting it and pushing it. And speaking of the Weather Channel, the reason the Weather Channel has been hyping this whole notion of global warming all these years, and I know they like to call it climate change now because they drove the phrase global warming into the ditch, so they had to come up with some euphemism. The Weather Channel wants to frighten you. The Weather Channel wants to frighten you so that you watch the Weather Channel. And then if you watch the Weather Channel in large numbers, then they can sell more soap. In other words, they can charge more for their commercial rates, which means the parent company makes a lot of money off the fear and the whipping up the concerns about climate change or global warming or what the sky is falling or whatever you'd like to call it. That's why that's done. It's 9:56. Bill Colley with you on Top Story this morning on News Radio 1310, KLIX and newsradio1310.com. I don't think that the people who voted in West Virginia and Michigan and Ohio and Pennsylvania that put Donald Trump into the White House this last year, I don't think they gave a hoot about all of this global warming talk. And that's what angers the elitists in both parties more than anything else, is that the public, after years and years and years, when we had just a monopoly in media where you had 3 alphabet networks and a handful of newspapers that were trying to tell people what they needed to think, they could get away with it. But they don't get away with it any longer because of the rise of the internet and because of talk radio, which is why they were on that kick for so long about fake news, because they no longer have that monopoly. I'll give you a good example of how this works. I made a reference to it in tomorrow morning's newspaper column. You can read it in the Time News or Times News or at magicvalley.com tomorrow morning. There was a Republican get-together, young Republicans at a college in Michigan last week. Somebody showed up who was not a member of the college Republicans and started passing out Valentines, referencing Adolf Hitler and the extermination of the Jews, saying, my love is so hot for you, it's like the burning of 6,000 Jews, with a picture of Hitler on the side. Media immediately denounced the young Republicans and saying, connecting young Republicans to this event, even though the young Republicans had no obvious involvement with it. On the other hand, when you had all of those Democrats who were smashing windows a couple of weeks ago and setting fires at Berkeley, nobody said Democrats are out rioting on these campuses. No, these are outside agitators. Yeah. Media is unable, through its own bias, to see its own hypocrisy in all of this. Rush Limbaugh's program is coming up next following news at 10 o'clock from Fox. Bill Colley saying, God willing, if the creek don't rise, they'll allow me to come back in here tomorrow and do this all over again. And then, of course, coming up after 1 o'clock news, it's Sean Hannity, Glenn Beck at 4, and Dave Ramsey tonight at 7 o'clock.